The gold standard was an accident. That's right. You've probably heard that the gold standard was one of the most widely used monetary systems in history. But not many people know that the gold standard emerged as a result of an accident. And the reason why it got abandoned, well, that's an interesting story as well. So that's what I'd like to discuss in today's video. The accidental origin of the gold standard, how it spread worldwide, and why it ultimately failed. In case you're new here, welcome to History Meets Finance. In this channel, we talk about, well, history and finance. We make interesting videos every single week about the story of money. We'll dive deep into topics like the origins of bankruptcy or how accounting worked in medieval times. So please do subscribe if you're new here to enjoy weekly videos where we go deep into the history of money. To better understand what the gold standard actually means, let's first understand what the concept of money represents. You see, the problem is people confuse the concept of money with currency. Currency is a system of money that is used by a specific country, but money, on the other hand, actually represents a broader meaning. It basically covers anything that people think is a store of value, and when they agree that the thing storing that value can be used to trade or exchange things, well, that's money too. Now, money can come in many forms like notes, coins, land, precious metals, your bank account records, and even things such as seashells. And that sounds simple enough, but the perceived value of these items can vary a lot depending on the supply and the demand. And if there's a high volatility in value, then people would just stop accepting it as money, making it worthless. To ensure that this is avoided, governments all over the world have tried various systems to stabilize the value of money. And in modern history, the most widely used standard has been the gold standard. Now, like I said earlier, the gold standard was a result of a silly accident. Picture this, it's 1717. Sir Isaac Newton comes into the picture. Yes, that's the guy who discovered the concept of gravity. Anyway, he's the master of the Royal Mint of England at the time as well, and he mistakenly sets the exchange rate of silver to gold way too low, and this quickly caused a severe reduction of silver in circulation in the country that lasted for decades. Basically, this meant that the country had defaulted to exclusively only use gold coins as a store of value, and then currency started being pegged to gold at a fixed exchange rate, and then the gold standard was born. The system was formalized in 1821. And this was also around the time that Britain's global influence was rapidly growing. They started introducing the gold standard to their growing number of colonies at the time. And other major economies such as the US were very quick to make the switch to the gold standard as well. You see, the US was also experiencing its own rapid growth, and it was looking for a system to help stabilize its currency. And finally, after the newly formed Germany also started implementing the gold standard, it was only a matter of time before the rest of the countries followed, and therefore the world's first international monetary system was established. So the international gold standard established by Great Britain remained in place until the start of World War I and the Great Depression that followed right afterwards. You see, the system had one major flaw. It was just too inflexible to respond to economic shocks quickly enough. For example, it hindered a government's ability to expand their money supply, which meant that many governments were unable to stimulate their own economies. There needed to be enough gold in reserves to back that up. With most of the world in a major recession during the Great Depression, nobody was willing to part with their precious gold, and this in turn led to further economic troubles. The final nail in the coffin was struck when the British government finally abandoned the gold standard in 1931. Dropping the gold standard helped in the short term, however, over the long term, it caused nations to compete in devaluing their currencies and engaging in trade protectionism. This led to increased economic and political tension, and a lot of this was a contributor to the onset of the Second World War. But this wasn't the end of the gold standard. Following the war, there was a renewed interest in the creation of a new gold standard. This was called the Bretton Woods system, and it differed from the old system in one major aspect. Only the US dollar had a fixed exchange rate with gold, and all the other countries were instead pegged to the US dollar. This provided them with the flexibility to renegotiate currency values to better deal with economic shocks. You see, the earlier gold standard was a floating exchange rate system, whereas the Bretton Woods system was different because it was a fixed exchange rate system. Now, this in theory was a good idea. It worked well. That is, until the United States economy began to show signs of strain. The Vietnam War, rising trade deficits, and France caused a lot of strain on the system. You see, France was one of the biggest purchasers of gold for its reserves. It meant that the US failed to maintain its own gold reserves to keep the gold standard functioning. Eventually, all of these factors forced the US government to drop the gold standard in 1971. This was originally supposed to be a temporary measure only, the idea that the dollar would be revalued and the system would resume. However, the decision to drop the gold standard stuck. The US government officially announced the abandonment of the gold standard right afterwards. So, is it ever going to come back? Since this event, currencies have not been backed by any major commodity. Instead, currencies would freely float on the market with exchange rates influenced by market forces. Some argue that this contributed to the rising rates of inflation and increased economic volatility. So it begs the question, should we ever return to the gold standard? I believe the answer is no. This is because in today's world with various competing economic powers, arriving at a consensus would be extremely difficult, probably impossible. I mean, the US could push for the Bretton Woods system again because at one point in time, they literally accounted for half the world's economy, and they held 80% of the world's currency reserves at one point. But today, no single country is in such a position. Plus, the modern economy has grown to be much more complex than it was ever before. Governments need more flexibility with their monetary policies. Now, as we discussed earlier, this level of inflexibility was a major shortcoming of the gold standard and why it was dropped in history twice. Now, while it was in place, the gold standard provides stability and trust in the monetary systems for many decades. However, it was eventually dropped because of the need of flexibility and adaptability in an evolving world. While some may still advocate for its return, the complexities of the modern economies and the lack of consensus would make it highly unlikely. If you like this breakdown, I think you'll like this video that I made about the history and origin of money itself. Check it out here and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one.